received a really interesting request to react to the subreddit Regretful Parents, and I gotta be honest, I don't know if I'm in the right headspace for that. I know there are a lot of really extreme takes on anonymous forums, though I do agree the topic of regretful parents is a really interesting one and a really important one for people to talk more about. So I figured, why don't I talk about the research on this topic instead? So that's exactly what this video will be, diving into the research to answer the question, why do some people regret having children? Now, admittedly, there's not a wealth of research on this topic, but that actually made it really simple for me to look at what is out there, so let's get into it. Firstly, how common is it for parents to regret becoming parents? In the US, rates are estimated to be around 7%. The highest rate so far documented in the research was from a Polish study at 13.6%, and on average, it looks like it tends to be around 10%. So it's relatively uncommon, but still millions of people when you actually run the numbers. And the rates of regretful parenting are similar among men and women, though it's believed the regrets might be caused by slightly different reasons. And this is a real issue. Not only because it's distressing for the parents, but also because it has really detrimental effects on the children themselves. So whether or not you personally feel empathy for these regretful parents, we should all have the same goal of lowering these rates, of making sure fewer unwanted children are born. And in order to do that, we need to understand why certain people regret becoming parents and others don't. I think sometimes it can be easy for us to look at parents and think, look, you made your bed and now you have to lay in it. Decisions have consequences and you decided to have a child. But we have to remember that in today's world, there are unfortunately a large number of people who become parents against their will, whether it's due to lack of adequate sex education, birth control, forced marriages, SA, abusive relationships, and someone not wanting or not planning a pregnancy has been associated with later difficulties in parenting, including postpartum depression, parenting stress, harsh and negligent parenting, behavioral and socio-emotional issues in the child, which, as you can imagine, further adds fuel to the toxic cycle. So being forced to carry a pregnancy to term definitely results in higher rates of regretful parents. And even more subtle forms of pressure do too, such as pro-natalist efforts by both individuals and policymakers. On the individual level, it's been documented in the research that women in particular receive a lot of messaging about how motherhood is the ultimate goal they should aspire to, and there's something wrong with them if they don't want that. And on a policy level, there are also a lot of pro-natalist initiatives across countries whose fertility rates are dropping right now, which from what I understand is not great economically long term. I don't quite understand what the fuss is about given how much overpopulation there is. But as an example, I heard that recently there's been an initiative in the United States to give new moms $5,000. Which, I'm sorry. I'm laughing because at the time of recording this, I'm about to give birth in less than 2 weeks. And I know that $5,000 doesn't even cover the cost of getting home from the hospital in the United States. Now, obviously, we can't determine causality based on this alone, but I don't think it's a coincidence that Poland, which has one of the highest rates of parental regret out of all the countries who've done research on this, also has one of the strictest anti-abortion regimes in Europe. And one of the other studies that I looked at found that fear of missing out tends to lead to people becoming parents in order to conform to the culture because they see other people doing and enjoying parenthood and they don't want to miss out, so they decide to go for it despite it not necessarily being aligned with their values and life goals. And then later on, when they realize that this path was not for them, that results in them being regretful parents. So clearly, people being pressured into becoming parents when it's not the right choice for them is a factor. But what do people actually regret about parenthood? According to a study from 2019, there are two types of regretful parents. The type who regrets certain conditions about having their children, and the type who regret having their children altogether. So let's start with the first category, people who regretted certain conditions of having children. This one is a lot more common, and it has has a lot less stigma and it's less taboo to talk about. These parents talk about how they have regrets around timing, for instance, wishing they'd had kids either sooner or later in life, and how unplanned pregnancies sometimes cause them to miss out on certain experiences. Sometimes they have regrets about the number of children they had. They wish they had more or fewer. Oftentimes this is where they'll have concerns about the stress of having multiple children. Sometimes they'll talk about the sacrifices they had to make, whether it's loss of money, time, education, missing the ability to sleep in, pursue hobbies, relax during their free time, lack of sleep and intimacy in their relationship. But nearly all of the parents who mentioned these sacrifices also described rewards that they wouldn't trade for anything in the world in the study. And remember this, we're going to come back to this idea of parenthood as containing both costs and benefits, because it's something that the second category of regretful parents were not able to kind of hold at the same time. Another condition of parenthood that somewhat regretful parents also referenced was their partner. They regretted who they had children with or how it changed their partner, whether it's physically or sexually or like emotionally, that all their attention was now going to the child, or the fact that their partner's not very involved in parenting, or the fact that they ended up breaking up and now they're linked to an ex that they dislike. They also referenced regrets about the external world. They sort of contrasted the times when they were raised versus the cruel state of today's world. And they expressed a lot of powerlessness in their ability to protect their kids. Now, I do wonder if there's a little bit of rose-tinted glasses going on here, because, for instance, one of the parents in the study talked about how when they were raising their children through 9/11, that was an incredibly scary time for them. And they were looking back at their own childhood and thinking, man, times were so much better now. I can tell you from my perspective, I feel like things were better in 2001 than they are currently. Also, if you go even further back to like the Cold War, for instance, the parents raising children during that time were dealing with the threat of annihilation, the threat of absolute apocalypse, of mutually assured destruction. But of course, those children grew up to later become parents who then also thought, oh, things were so much better when I was a kid versus now that I'm an adult and I have to protect my children. So again, I kind of wonder if this is a little bit of a phenomenon where parents just want to have a sense of control and to be able to protect their children. And they're looking back on their own childhood, not really seeing the ways in which their own parents stressed out about wanting to keep them safe as well. But for this category of regretful parents, parents who regretted certain conditions of being parents, the authors say, overall, circumstantial regrets appear to create no dissonance between emotions felt toward their children and norms of parenthood, and users gave little indication that they were unable to communicate these regrets openly in their everyday lives. So again, it's not very taboo, it's not super stigmatized to acknowledge this and to say, there are certain things about the way I became a parent or the experience of parenthood that I do regret. That's different from the second category of regretful parents in the study, which was those who flat out regretted having children. These parents were also careful to distinguish love from regret, but they referenced things like having difficult children. They referenced disliking their child, sometimes disliking the difficulties of having a child with a physical or intellectual disability. And you know, when it comes to this, I can only imagine how incredibly difficult it must be to raise a child who's chronically ill or disabled in some way. And I have a lot of empathy for those parents. At the same time, I have a very visceral reaction to parents who describe their children as difficult just because they act like children or just because their parenting leaves much to be desired and therefore their children are acting out. So I think that like within the category difficult children, there are sort of two types of parents. Parents of children who absolutely have certain difficulties versus parents who just call their children difficult because, again, their parenting leaves much to be desired. Another theme among these regretful parents was perceiving themselves as a bad parent. They had doubts about their ability to be a parent. They had their own mental health issues. They disliked the way that parenthood changed to them. They also expressed a lot of parenthood disdain, which is lamenting the loss of their child-free life or the sacrifices that they made, hating the mundanity of everyday life with children. And they disclosed a desire to be child-free. They felt they caved into having children due to pressure or unplanned pregnancies, but they always yearned and continue to yearn to be child-free. And some of these parents even gave up custody and visitation in order to pursue that dream of being child-free once they had kids. Which again, I struggle with this one a little bit because whether you wanted children or not, once you have them, you are responsible for them. That's when it becomes your responsibility to regulate those feelings of regret so that you don't cause trauma and abandonment and neglect in the next generation of children. Though, some might argue at that point, if someone is willing to give up visitation, wants nothing to do with their children, their kids might be better off. So, I don't know. Regardless, it seems that there are two types of regret. One shaped by external factors and one shaped by more internal factors. So let's talk about some of the external factors at play here. It seems like a lot of the factors associated with parental regret boil down to lack of support. Now, the Polish study that I referenced found that parental regret was associated with worse financial situation, single parent status, having a child with special needs, all things that make it harder to raise a child. Starting with financial strain. Parents who said their financial situation was bad tended to have higher rates of parental regret. Parents who reported high degrees of parental burnout also had higher rates of regret. They said they were tired with parenthood, they felt like a bad parent, they were withdrawn from their child. Single parents had much higher rates of parental burnout, which, if you are a single parent, truly, I think you are an absolute superhero. I don't know how you do it. I feel like it must be a constant acute stress, because even raising a child with two parents can be so challenging and is often not enough. You often need like a village, as they say. So to do it on your own as one person, and probably to also be needing to support this child financially as well as be their primary caregiver, you must be incredibly strong if you do that. And I completely understand why that would make it very challenging to be a parent and make you regret possibly your choice. Now, despite the study showing that there were these external factors that impacted parental regret, the authors did also say the results obtained clearly indicate that parents who regret parenthood come from all layers of society. They are present among the wealthy and the well-educated, as well as among the poor and those with only primary education. Some of them have children with special needs and some of them do not, and some of them are married or in informal relationships and some of them do not have a partner. So basically what the authors are trying to communicate is like, yes, there are external factors at play, but that is not the only thing going on here. And that's where I think we can talk about the more internal factors at play as well. Let's discuss the individual and personality characteristics that make people more prone to becoming regretful parents. Because as Piotrowski points out, regretting parenthood can be strongly personality conditioned and can further increase psychopathology among parents and destructive attitudes toward their children. So the study found that parental regret was also associated with a higher ACE score, which is a marker of childhood trauma, poor psychological and somatic health, vulnerability to social evaluation, and stronger parental identity crisis. Perfectionism was one that was much more common among parents who had parental regret. Specifically, the two components of perfectionism as they defined it were external locus of control and fear of negative evaluation from others. So the parents who regret becoming parents, some of them might be overly perfectionistic. They might be too hard on themselves or comparing themselves to other people, other parents. They also struggle with identifying as parents. They have a low commitment to identify as a parent, a low identification with the role of a parent, and a lack of active exploration about the parental domain. Now, I find this to be interesting because I always told myself before getting pregnant and after getting pregnant, I don't want to be one of those people who makes motherhood her entire identity. There is more to me than just one thing, one facet. I don't want to become one of those people who this is all she ever talks about. But this makes me think, there might actually be a benefit to making certain aspects of your life a part of your identity, because clearly there is some sort of protective mechanism there that you identify as a parent, and therefore it makes it easier to make meaning of your more challenging parenting experiences. The development of parental identity is based on comparing one's own experiences in the realization of the parental role with one's expectations, needs, and values. A satisfactory course through this process leads to identification with the decisions one has made and to defining oneself through the prism of these decisions. It was observed that the individuals who regretted having children experienced strong and marked parental identity diffusion. They identified with the role of a parent only to a low extent, and they also had a much weaker motivation to consider issues connected with parenthood and to search for deeper information about it. In this group of parents, we could observe doubts about how to realize the parental role and a conviction that parenthood does not fit them. Piotrowski suggested that regretting parenthood can be the final effect of disturbances in the development of parental identity. So basically, this researcher proposed that regretful parents had reached this final stage of basically being unable to integrate their identity with parenthood. Like I said, regretful parents also tend to have higher than average rates of trauma history from their own childhood. Parents who regret having children were more often raised in an environment characterized by violence and rejection. This makes perfect sense because it is very common for people who are mistreated as children to feel contempt for children and to be out of touch with their own inner child. This book that I read a few months ago, it's like the book you wish your parents had read and your kids will be glad you did, or something like that. It was an excellent book. Highly recommend it. But it talks about how when you're a parent and you start to notice yourself getting frustrated with your child acting like a child, that's usually a moment to pause and think about, how did your own parents react when you acted like a child in the way your child is currently acting? So if they're, getting really overexcited while playing a game and you suddenly feel contempt for them and you're like, okay, settle down, buddy. Can you ever remember being made to feel like that by your parents? Children who were allowed to be children, who were validated and supported throughout their childhood, don't typically grow up to become adults who feel contempt for other children being children. So that's one thing. Another issue is that having trauma history is associated with emotion regulation issues, distress tolerance issues, all of which can make it more challenging to deal with the stress of parenting, which can result in higher rates of regret. Mental health issues, like I mentioned, have also been associated with higher rates of parental regret. And here we really have this question of which came first, the chicken or the egg. Like if someone is depressed, they might frequently ruminate about things they wish had gone differently. And parental regret can be one of those many ruminations. Or, on the other hand, it could be that somebody is regretting their decision of being a parent because it wasn't the right fit for them, and maybe that's causing them to feel depressed. A study from 2013 actually showed that poor mental health predicted later parental regret. So it's possible that it might be in the direction of poor mental health causes parental regret. But there is definitely a reciprocal relationship between the two, between internal factors and external factors. For example, single parents have more issues with parental identification. Parents of disabled children tend to experience higher rates of perfectionism and regret as well. So there's like this loop that feeds itself between internal and external factors. Also, having a harder time postpartum has been associated with things like pregnancy complications, difficult labor and delivery, having a sickly infant, having a temperamentally difficult child, poverty, low education level, and younger age. Something else that's been documented in the research is a propensity for FOMO among regretful parents. This fear of missing out. And I do think that there is an individual component to FOMO. I think that there are some people who are a lot more likely to experience it than others. And in this particular study, FOMO was documented as one of the reasons why regretful parents decided to have kids, because they were afraid of missing out on enjoyable experiences they saw other parents having. But you can also often hear FOMO in the way that regretful parents talk about wishing they were child-free and looking around at their peers who don't have children and envying that as well. So it kind of begs the question, if you are a person who has a propensity for FOMO, would you ever not feel regret, or would you feel regret no matter what path you chose? Now, a study from 2023 found that there are 3 competing discourses, and regretful parents reference each of them when discussing their regret. And this one actually looked at answers from the Reddit forum Child Free. So the 3 competing discourses were parenting is heaven, parenting is hell on earth, and parenting as a choice. So parenting is heaven asserts that everyone should have a child. Having a child is normal and natural, and people without children are missing out on a fulfilling life. So the regretful parents who referenced this discourse said things like, I never ever wanted to have kids, but you know how it goes. You'll change your mind when you get older, when you meet the right girl, when you have one of your own. The discourse of parenting is hell on earth says that being a parent is difficult, it's a lifestyle constraint, and when regretful parents made reference to this discourse, they said things like, they're hard work, they take all your money and time and energy. Even if you love them, you'll always resent them, and you'll have no one to talk to about it because everyone would look down on you. And the discourse of parenting as a choice says that being a parent is a personal and autonomous decision, and people who referenced this discourse said, please never succumb to the pressure, never allow a partner, spouse, family to convince you. Having a child never swayed me from the deep-rooted desire to not have children. Now, what I found to be very interesting about these discourses is they're all very black and white. Regretful parents believed or were made to believe that either parenting was the best thing on earth or the worst thing on earth. And I hear little amount of middle ground and nuance in these conversations. I'm not hearing a lot of duality. I'm not hearing there are some ways in which parenthood is challenging and there are some ways in which parenthood is rewarding. You can even hear it in how extreme the language is that they're using. Like the person who said, even if you love them, you'll always resent them. They could have said that in a different, more nuanced way. They could have said, I love my children, though I struggle with resentment when XYZ happens, when they're acting out in blah, blah way. If they were to instead say it that way, they would be not talking about everyone as a whole. They would just be talking about their own experience, and they wouldn't be using all or nothing language like always. Or the person who said, please never succumb to the pressure. They could have instead said, the pressure of having children can cause some people to become regretful parents. If they had said it in that way, they wouldn't have been telling other people what to do. They wouldn't have been acting like everyone else is in exactly the same boat as them. So there's something very extreme about the way some of these regretful parents communicate their regret, particularly on anonymous online forums. Something that makes me wonder, is there maybe an underlying mental health concern at play here? Is there something about the way they're thinking about parenthood that could be modified and improved with therapy? Because it sounds to me like a lot of splitting, a defense mechanism where something is either the best thing in the world or the worst thing in the world. Now, let's talk about regret a little bit more broadly. Regret is a natural human experience. In one large Dutch sample, 65% of people said they regret something from their lives, because regret is meant to motivate us to do things differently in the future. It serves a purpose, like all emotions do. But the higher the amount of regrets a person reports, the lower their life satisfaction gets, and the greater the amounts of painful emotions that they feel. And here again, which one came first, the chicken or the egg? Are highly regretful people unhappy because of their regret, or do they have a specific way of thinking about their lives that causes them both regret and unhappiness? Who is the most prone to feeling high amounts of regret? Turns out it's people who tend to ruminate, who struggle with emotion regulation, who are higher in neuroticism. There is like a personality characteristic of someone who tends to be more regretful than the average person. I personally never feel regret. I am a person who tends to see the glass as half full in retrospect, who tends to see the silver lining even in situations that are objectively very bad. For example, this past year almost, when my husband and I moved to another country, we experienced so many roadblocks in my husband getting his residency. We experienced xenophobia. We were told that me having a Romanian passport probably impeded his ability to get a residency card. And when he finally got his residency card after, I think, 8 months, I was able to realize that it was for the best. Because if he had gotten it sooner, he would have needed to renew it before we moved to our final destination, which is a different country. So the fact that it took us so long and that it was so grueling and such an awful fucking process was actually for the best. Because this way, he doesn't need to renew his residency permit, which only lasts him a year. We can still move to another country at the end of the year like we planned. Another example, I really wanted to have my baby shower in London. And I was really sad because my husband didn't have his residency card. We couldn't leave the country. The weekend of my baby shower, the London airport shut down because of a fire. So everyone that would have been flying that day to go to a baby shower in London would have been unable to make it. So it was for the best that we weren't able to have it where I wanted it. Even when things don't go your way, even when things are frustrating, there is a way to reframe it in your head and to think, actually, this is for the best. And, sometimes I even think about things I'm not even aware of. Like your flight gets canceled, for instance. It's frustrating, but you never know. If you had gotten on that flight, maybe you would have taken an earlier taxi to your hotel, and maybe you would have gotten into a car accident. You never know what would have happened. And sometimes in order to be psychologically healthy, you need to have this somewhat delusional belief that everything works out for the best. And when it comes to regretful parents in particular, apparently it's this phenomenon called post-birth rationalization in the research, where people who initially didn't want children but went on to have them, most of the time will start to, because of cognitive dissonance, rationalize their decision to have a child and start to lean into it. Mothers who form a close, loving bond with an originally unwanted or unintended child would alter their perceptions of the initial unwanted or unintended status of the child so as to resolve the dissonance or inconsistency between their current behaviors and attitudes. So maybe some level of post hoc rationalization is healthy and necessary for us to function as human beings without always considering what if. What if I missed out? What if I made the wrong mistake? However, it does seem like this post-birth rationalization phenomenon is specific to adults because teenage pregnancies aren't characterized by decreasing levels of regret over time. Those actually increase over time. But let's talk about the elephant in the room for a second. The elephant in the room, the way I see it, is that regret is a natural human emotion. And emotions are never something to be ashamed of or, something that's wrong. A person having an emotional experience is something that we should have empathy and compassion for. And also, can we acknowledge that some regretful parents are harming their children in the way that they're handling their regret? Because we know that regretting parenthood is associated with harsher parenting. And I wonder if there's a negative loop there, where parents who are more regretful are harsher parents, causing their children to behave more difficult, causing more regret on their part and more harsh parenting, and just the cycle goes on and on and on. When a parent feels a disdain for children or for their child specifically, there is no way that kids don't pick up on it. Kids are very attuned to even subtle emotional changes in their parents. If you've ever heard of the still face experiment, where mothers were just emotionally flat in front of their babies lost their minds. And those were babies, right? Children pick up when they're not wanted, when they are the source of contempt, when they're blamed for their parents' unhappiness. And I could make a video on this in and of itself, the experience of being raised on a regretful parent, if you guys want me to look into the research on that more closely. But this is a really serious topic because, again, we need to balance empathy for regretful parents with acknowledging that some of the ways regretful parents handle being a regretful parent are not okay. And although I think feeling regret is a natural human experience, it does not give parents free license to express that regret however they like. It doesn't mean it's okay to make your child feel unwanted, mistreated, treated with disdain, labeled as difficult. Also, I have said it before and I'll say it again. There are some things you should probably not film yourself saying and post to the entire internet with your face attached to them. Saying that you hate being a parent and that you regret having your child is probably one of those things in my book, because your child, in all likelihood, will come across that at some point. But moreover, even if they never see that video, the energy that you expressed in that video has now been strengthened and reinforced. And that's going to impact your parenting, and that's going to impact your child. But to put this into a little bit of real life applications here, how can we prevent these rates of regretful parents? Although the studies that I mentioned were correlational, they were not experiments. I don't even know how you would induce regret in a parent experimentally. Here are some of the things that we can maybe speculate would help bring down the rates of regretful parents. Decreasing the number of people who don't want kids and end up having them. Basically, stop pressuring people into having children, both on an individual level and in terms of policy. Give people access to sex education, birth control, abortions. Also, provide societal support. Give people more affordable healthcare, childcare, fix the economy, induce a greater sense of community and less individualism so that parents can have more support and feel less overwhelmed and therefore regret their children less. In terms of clinical interventions that we can target individual or personality characteristics, I think targeting perfectionism is really important to do in therapy, giving people a more internal locus of control, providing self-care and emotion regulation strategies, treating their trauma history, treating any underlying mental health issues that cause maladaptive patterns of thinking like depression, anxiety, postpartum concerns, help parents find meaning in their identity as parents, induce some level of healthy rationalization, maybe some positive psychology interventions would be really helpful here. Address the black and white thinking. I'm thinking dialectical behavioral therapy would be really helpful for this, and that would also be really good for parents who have trauma and for parents who struggle with emotion regulation and distress tolerance, since those are two key components of DBT. Relationship counseling, since we know that parents who have trouble with their partner or who are divorced tend to experience higher rates of regret. and helping people gain clarity on their life goals before making the decision to become parents. All of these, I think, would help minimize the rates of regretful parents. This video was a mouthful. Let me know what you thought about the research I talked about. Let me know your own experiences with this topic. I would love to hear your personal anecdotes down below, and I'll see you soon. Tell me what you